Capcom is a video game company that really likes it when its own games get adaptations. Over the years, numerous Capcom games have gotten movies or TV shows. Street Fighter, Monster Hunter, Devil May Cry, even Power Stone and Darkstalkers, just to name a few. But there's one that stands out as one that has been particularly milked for cinematic potential: Resident Evil. When it comes to video game adaptations, Resident Evil actually makes a ton of sense to adapt. The games have a cinematic style to them and take heavily from horror movies, like the zombie movies of George A. Romero. Resident Evil has a ton of different characters, settings, and monsters, and even after just a few Resident Evil games had been released, the series had become Capcom's biggest franchise ever. So, in 2002, the first Resident Evil movie was made. It did well, but wasn't that good, and then they made 6 more. There are 7 live-action Resident Evil movies, and even 1 TV show. None of them have been received well over the board critically, and they've only really made people feel franchise fatigue near the end. So, when it was announced that a reboot was coming in 2026, I think I can confidently say the reception was mostly, just let it go bruh, it's over. But then something happened. Its director Zach Cregger made a pretty good movie called Weapons, which got my attention on his name, and then a teaser for the new Resident Evil movie came out that definitely got a lot of people talking. Most notably because of just how far it deviates from the source material. I have a lot to say on Resident Evil 2026, and whether it really can justify its own existence as a movie. But first, let's talk about the movie franchise Resident Evil has found itself spawned into. The first 6 Resident Evil movies were all either written or directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, the Paul Thomas Anderson of really bad video game movies. They play up the action side of the franchise way more than the games released at the time ever did. I would compare the first Resident Evil series in tone to Van Helsing or the Underworld franchise, which both released roughly when the first Resident Evil movie was coming out. It uses scary elements like zombies, but for the most part, they're dumb action movies about secret agents that later shift into zombie apocalypse movies. Nowadays, action is often seen as a core pillar of Resident Evil alongside the horror, and looking at new entries like Village or Requiem, it's clear that Capcom's priority is balancing the two aspects. But action being a core element of the franchise wasn't really a thing in 2002, before Resident Evil 4 came along and changed the franchise. In 2002, Resident Evil was known for fixed camera angles, intense combat and resource management, and the occasional stupid battle against a giant fucking snake or something. The sleek, badass action and the femme fatale Alice didn't really fit Resident Evil at the time. This movie series got entries until 2016 with Resident Evil: The Final Chapter, and they all frankly made too much money. I've still seen lots of people who don't even know that Resident Evil is a game franchise because of how stupidly big the reach of these movies are. With these movies, the accuracy to the source material kinda comes and goes. Occasionally, they'll introduce a character from the games to have a small role or cameo, but they often don't stay important for long and just kinda slip out of the story to let Mila Jovovich do more things on screen. Resident Evil: Welcome to Raccoon City was released in 2021, and it completely rebooted the franchise, bringing it more in line with events that actually happened in the games. It directly adapted the events of both Resident Evil 1 and 2 with all the recognizable characters in the movie. It was largely criticized for being an unfocused mess that was just made to satisfy fans by showing them recognizable imagery. It was cheap and successful enough for Capcom to want to make more movies though. I think the Resident Evil movies were both very exemplary of the times in Hollywood in which they were made. The Anderson movies were made when the X-Men movies were huge. They adapted source material that was seen as nerdy to try and make them into huge film franchises, while smoothing over their goofier aspects in an insecurity way that only made them goofier in the end. Welcome to Raccoon City is from a new era of adaptation, where accuracy to the source material is seen as a virtue, and appealing to what fans already like is seen as what an adaptation should do. It's an era where finally showing Wolverine in a yellow costume will get people to cheer, and surely they'll want to see as much Resident Evil as possible in one movie. From what can be gleaned about Zach Cregger's Resident Evil, it looks like it'll have its own completely new approach that shares some similarities and many differences from both types of adaptation. When Resident Evil 2026 was first happening, I did not give a shit at all. We don't need a new Resident Evil movie. Get this out of here. It doesn't need to exist. I thought we were just gonna get Welcome to Raccoon City 2, and it would make just as little of a cultural splash. But then something interesting happened. The casting was revealed, and to my surprise, not a single one of the characters in the game were actually from Resident Evil. I started to think the absolute worst. Not only are we going to get a new Resident Evil, it's going to be one with zero respect for the source material that can't even add a single character from the games, much less build on its themes. Eventually, we got the teaser from the movie, which shares pretty much nothing from the game besides the vague concept of zombies in Raccoon City. I definitely can't say if the movie looks good or not from a brief teaser, but what it does look like is an incredibly focused story meant to be deeply horrifying that isn't taking the time to bring classic characters or plot lines from the games to the screen. I don't think Albert Wesker is going to start showing up and flying all over the screen. After thinking about it more though, the teaser kind of reminds me on some levels of Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is my favorite entry in the Resident Evil series. It was made at a point in the franchise where the scares were at an all-time low, and so was confidence in the brand after Resident Evil 6 had released. It completely changed the setting and the gameplay, adopting a first-person camera for the first time in the series. It was set in just one house in rural Louisiana, which brings to mind the original Resident Evil's focus on one mansion location. It also brings in flavor of horror movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Later it is revealed that the T-Virus and Umbrella are kind of tangentially related to the events of the game, and the protagonist Chris Redfield does eventually show up, but for 90% of the game, it has basically nothing to do with Resident Evil besides zombies, guns, puzzles, and healing herbs. It doesn't even play like any Resident Evil, including the classic ones, but something about it just feels like Resident Evil. It has resource management, tough decision making, and it goes back to its horror roots. It's also a compelling horror game, and is really fun to play. I genuinely feel like if Capcom had all the resources available today when planning out Resident Evil in 1996, it would have looked something like Resident Evil 7, albeit probably goofier and with a story very different to what we got. Most of the villains in Resident Evil 7 are just hillbillies. The quality of Resident Evil 7, to me, speaks to the versatility of Resident Evil as a franchise. What it represents is more than just Jill, Chris, and Leon, and while the series often sticks to what works, it's done all kinds of things. Resident Evil games have literally brought us all across the world. When I see the Resident Evil movie trailer, I think back to how people must have felt on Resident Evil 7's release when they find out that their only playable main character is just some guy. Resident Evil 2026 is taking the approach of, let's just try above all else to do something different. Zach Cregger has done interviews that I think shows he knows his stuff. He's commented on resource management and having to move slowly and deliberately as positive aspects of the old games. In a statement that seems pretty much made to anticipate fan backlash, he's also stated that he doesn't want to just remake things that have already happened in the games. Just doing Leon's story again would be redundant. I have to agree. His approach is certainly bolder than how I'd adapt Resident Evil, but what would be the point in repeating a story again when the series has been proven to be more versatile than that? There's this idea that a movie is an inherently superior art form to video games when it comes to storytelling. Being cinematic is seen as a value for many video games, and oftentimes games' stories only get truly mainstream prestige after being adapted into movies. I think that's silly, and games and movies are different art forms with different ways of telling stories. In adapting a game, you should do what works best for a movie, not what works best for fans of a game. But it is a difficult balancing act because you still want it to be in conversation with the original. Otherwise, what's the point of attaching it to an IP in the first place? Kreger has talked about the Resident Evil games doing well at having characters move from point A to point B, and that being an aspect he wants to put in the movie. At first, my thought was that's kinda nonsensical, but no, I actually kinda get what he means. Video games in the vein of Resident Evil often have an inherent adventurousness to the way they feel in a way that I don't think movies can capture as well or as easily. When you sit down to play a game, play for 3 hours, and progress from a police station to an underground laboratory, that makes it feel earned in a way that movies have to work harder to earn. That's why I think TV shows tend to be better mediums to adapt games than movies, except for the Resident Evil TV show. So, to see Kreger trying to adapt what makes the actual gameplay and the core of what Resident Evil is, instead of just taking a bunch of characters and plotlines from the games, I think that's promising, and if nothing else, a compelling way to adapt video games. If you hear all that and still think Resident Evil 2026 is too far off from actual Resident Evil, I can understand where you're coming from. But the thing is, a new Resident Evil movie was probably gonna happen anyways. As soon as Welcome to Raccoon City released, it was pretty much a race to make a follow-up, and in a different timeline, we could have seen any number of other people making their own Resident Evil movies instead of Zach Kreger. We live in a film landscape where the majority of movies get made are based on IPs, because existing IPs are a majority of the movies that do well. Something like Resident Evil 2026 being made allows a director to just kinda do their own thing, keep it vaguely connected to an existing property, and to give their movie a lot more success than it ever would have had otherwise. To borrow another example from movies, look at Evil Dead Rise. That movie wasn't super connected to Evil Dead, but it had enough in common to be called Evil Dead, and it made Lee Cronin more well known than he would have been before. It's far from a perfect solution, but if every movie has to be based on IPs, why not let them be different while still being in conversation with the past? The new Resident Evil might just exemplify a new way of handling adaptation that's emerged in the 2020s, which we haven't really seen before. I'm aware of the irony here because the original Resident Evil movie franchise, say what you will about it, was definitely a director doing his thing. It might not have been a very good director, but he definitely had a role in molding Resident Evil into what he wanted it to be, the way Kreger is doing here. I can't offer a neat solution to that, and I am aware that this model of franchise that's starting to emerge will probably end up in some duds. But I will say, I think Zach Kreger is probably a good director. How could you not trust someone who is in Space Potatoes? I won't say Resident Evil 2026 is gonna be amazing automatically because I don't know that for sure. But what I can say is that I like the approach it's taking, and I hope there's a lot of goodwill for it. Any way it goes, it's gonna be a bizarre adaptation that shows a bizarre way of making films. I'm excited to see how it will go. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.